Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. All right. On behalf of KPBS and all of our community partners in support of One Book, One San Diego, I'd like to say good morning and welcome. Welcome to our in-person audience here at the Comic-Con Museum, and welcome to all of you joining us online. How's everyone this morning? Great. Well, a little bit about One Book, One San Diego. We are 16 years old here in the San Diego region, and we're all about celebrating literacy. So we encourage everyone to nominate their favorite books, and then we have a couple of committees that review all of the nominations, this year over 400, and then a couple of books are selected, one for the adult category, one for the teen category, one for the kids category, and one for Spanish language readers. And then we encourage all of the San Diego region and Baja California to read the same books, celebrate these books, and have some great discussion around the books. So this year, our teen selection was The Magic Fish. Let's hear it for The Magic Fish. So I know you all have read The Magic Fish. Some of you multiple times, I'm sure, and you've enjoyed it. And we're super excited to have Trung Le Nguyen with us today to share the magic behind the book. I'd like to thank our One Book sponsors, which we'll show here up on the screen. And we have several community partners that make One Book, One San Diego happen each year. I'd like to thank especially the San Diego Public Library, the San Diego County Library, and all of our event partners today, which include Arts Bus Express, Little Fish Comic Book Studio, the Comic-Con Museum, and the San Diego Unified School District. Speaking of the San Diego Unified School District, I'd like to turn it over to the superintendent for a few words.
Hello, I'm Dr. Lamont Jackson, the superintendent of the San Diego Unified School District. Everyone at San Diego Unified is thrilled to partner with the San Diego Public Library, the San Diego County Library, and KPBS to present this year's One Book, One San Diego author event for tweens and teens. One Book, One San Diego is celebrating 16 years in our community, and the San Diego Unified School District is once again participating in the program, which offers students and families and educators the opportunity to engage in meaningful conversations around literacy. This year's book, The Magic Fish, is profoundly relevant and artistically rendered in a style that is truly exquisite. Thank you to author Trung Le Nguyen for bringing this story to life in a way that is accessible to people of all ages. This story is timeless because it explores the human experience of recognizing and authentically showing up in our own identities. And it is an exercise in building bridges, even in the face of constraints posed by, but not limited to, communication and culture. Learning about this topic can help us to better understand and support the people we know as our friends, our classmates, our neighbors, and our colleagues, and even our family members. It is a privilege for our youth in San Diego Unified to delve into this graphic novel that provides a glimpse into such a formative stage of human development. We are honored to have you join us today to discuss The Magic Fish. I want to thank a few folks. First, thank you to KPBS. Thank you to the San Diego Public Library, and thank you to the San Diego County Library for bringing us together through the power of stories and literacy. To each of you, I say Ubuntu.
Thank you to Superintendent Jackson for his remarks. Without further ado, I'd like to bring up Alonzo Nunes, who will be our moderator today. Alonzo graduated from the School of Visual Arts, majoring in comic illustration. A third-generation San Diegan, he's always had a passion for the comic art form in all of its various styles, genres, and purposes. He is an active comic professional. So, ladies and gentlemen, all here, it can happen. If you are passionate about comics, you can have a career in comics. He's an active comic professional, a 2021 Eisner Comic Industry Judge, and founder of Little Fish Comic Book Studio. I'd like to bring up Alonzo Nunes.
All right, hello everyone. How you guys doing today? Let's try that one more time. How you guys doing? Okay, awesome, good. I know it's a rainy day in San Diego, which makes it feel like we should all be tucked away in our houses, but we're here. We're talking about Magic Fish. It's going to be an awesome time, I promise. How many of you out there already read it? Okay, good. You can lie. All right, I want to bring out now the author and cartoonist behind Magic Fish. So just as a little bit of introduction, Trung Le Nguyen is a Vietnamese-American comic book artist and writer from Minnesota. Trung's first original graphic novel is The Magic Fish, and it was published in 2020 through Random House Graphic, an imprint of Penguin Random House. It was nominated for an Eisner and also won 2 Harvey Awards. Trung has also contributed work for DC Comics, Oni Press, Boom Studios, and Image Comics. He currently lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and raises a small flock of very spoiled hens. I definitely want to talk about them. He is fond of fairy tales, kids' cartoons, and rom-coms of all stripes. Let's give a warm welcome to Trung Le Nguyen, please. All right. Welcome, Trung.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
so much for having me. That was such a
Absolutely.
great intro. I appreciated that.
I do want to talk about the hens at some point.
Okay.
But I thought we'd start by, in your own words, can you explain what the Magic Fish is about?
Sure. So The Magic Fish is, on its face, it's a coming out story that is occurring within a household of a couple of different cultural generations. So it's about trying to express something about yourself around culture and language that might be a little bit of a barrier in that context. So it's a story about a young boy and his mother trying to tell each other about themselves through going to the library and reading fairy tales to one another.
It's really fantastic, and it incorporates bits, obviously, of autobiography, bits you've talked about from other stories from the community around you. What was it's always curious to me, what was the reaction like from your family or from people that maybe knew that their stories were being pulled as you worked on it?
Oh, sure. Well, so I decided that I wasn't going to write a straight autobiography because I didn't feel like I could tell my story without also kind of accidentally telling someone else's story. And so I repositioned the work into the realm of fiction entirely, so I was much more comfortable playing really fast and loose with all of the different event details. But a lot of the stories that were sort of taken from sort of the angle of my parents' experience or from my brother's experience, those things were things that they were sort of aware that I was doing, but also my parents fully had no idea that I made comics. And so they just thought I was taking a really vested interest in their lives. They're like, oh, you've never asked us these deep questions about our past before. So they didn't really know that I was making like an actual published book until afterward, and they thought that it was lovely when they read it finally.
Was there any reaction afterwards when they did read it that surprised you or that you were not expecting in terms of what they responded to?
Gosh, my parents were super excited. I like a part of my professional journey was that I really wanted to get a job that would be really easy to explain to my parents. And comics was not that. And so I really truly thought that it was just going to be a hobby for a while. And then I, got a book contract and I am doing it professionally now. And their reaction to it, and I don't know why I was so surprised about this because they've always been very supportive, but a part of my pitch in doing The Magic Fish and in getting comic books into classrooms is that comic books are, they're a hybrid language where you combine words and pictures together. And so it is sort of a cultural bridge where if you're feeling like your acuity or your advancement in terms of reading just regular books is a little bit low, you can read a comic book that helps facilitate a positive relationship with reading a book so that you can either move on to other things or you can explore comics with a little bit more depth. Like it's something that helps people love reading, and my parents have never been big readers, and so I assumed that they weren't going to read the book, and then they did, and I was like, of course they did. It's a comic book. It helps you like reading more, but I was still surprised, and my parents had really lovely reactions to it. My dad was very excited, and he started pitching the book to his friends, and so did my mother, so I was just like there was a little part of me that was like, oh gosh, Mom, Dad, this is so embarrassing, but also, I was so happy that they liked the book. Yeah.
Was your dad like, for just a couple more bucks, I can get it signed for you?
No, my mom was. My dad was not.
That's amazing. The book weaves in these three fairy tales with the framing device. Can you talk about the selection of those three fairy tales? Kind of what those meant to you or why they kind of spoke to you as the ones you chose?
Sure. Okay. So I've always loved fairy tales because as a kid I used to go to the library a lot because my parents didn't speak or read a lot of English, and so we learned English together by reading stories together, just like in the book. And that was something that was always really precious to me, and I chose the books, and I always picked the books with my favorite pictures in them, and those were always fairy tales. I would later go on to study the artists who made those books and why those books existed the way that they did, but they've always been very special to me, and I think the thing that fascinates me about fairy tales is that they're a lot like people, like fairy tales. exist in a lot of different cultures in very similar ways. And so you'll have the same story showing up in one culture and time, and then showing up again in another one, and every culture has kind of similar stories. And I think that it highlighted to me that fairy tales and storytelling is this organic process where stories can change clothes and change priorities in order to survive in new places. And I realized that the thing that I loved about fairy tales was that it's a process of community building. When you tell someone a story, it's not about surprising them or being the most original. You can tell an old story, but because you're telling it, the priorities that you have, the things that make you excited about being in the world, those things come through. And so you're telling each other about yourselves a little bit when you're telling old stories. And that's why fairy tales are precious to me. I specifically chose the Cinderella stories because I wanted to compare a Western Cinderella story that was a little bit more familiar to an American audience, to the Vietnamese Cinderella, which I heard growing up, because I read Cinderella when I was little with my dad in English, and he was like, oh, you know what, we have a very similar fairy tale to this in Vietnamese, except there's a little bit of cannibalism in it. It's gonna be great, you'll love it. So I'd always wanted to compare those stories, and I think examining that Cinderella stories are always about transition and finding agency and learning how to kind of take back your power under the circumstances in which you find yourself. Like, that's something that is really resonant with a lot of immigrant families. And The Little Mermaid is similar in that it's a story about someone who sacrifices her power and her agency and her voice to be with the person that she loves, and she has to move to a place where she has no support network. And that is a story that's very resonant with my parents and their immigrant experience.
Yeah. Speaking of the cannibalistic Vietnamese Cinderella, I don't want to spoil bits for anyone that hasn't read it yet, but that one obviously stands out in terms of its, I think especially for American audiences, it's much more aggressive telling, right? We hear about the origins of a lot of the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales and how they started off much more aggressive, but kids in America generally don't read those unless they have a certain type of parent. Was there ever a thought that you might tone down some of the more aggressive, no pun intended, teeth of the of the Vietnamese Cinderella?
No, actually. I think all of the constraints that I had to work with were in terms of I need to hit my deadlines. They were never like because I feel like if you try to tone down those stories, because I'm writing for a teen audience, and oftentimes people get very touchy about like, oh, you're writing for young people, you have to treat them with kid gloves, and I find that to be so condescending because kids are really good. Like, young readers are very good at being like, hey, I'm ready for this. This is totally my thing, or they can be like, this is not something that I want, or it's not something that I'm ready for. I'm going to put it down. I'm going to find something else. And so they have they know themselves really well. They know how to do that. So I didn't feel like I needed to tone stuff down. And also the thing that I am, coming to realize is that fairy tales, like the closest thing to a fairy tale these days is a creepypasta. Those urban legends that you tell each other to like kind of give yourself a sense of dread or a sense of imagining of the world around you, a sense of wonder. Those things kind of go hand in hand. And so those urban legends that we tell each other these days are very similar to the way that fairy tales were told around a campfire orally. And so those things kind of exist simultaneously. And if you've read Goosebumps, you're ready to read a fairy tale about cannibalism. Like, it's fine.
That's a one more blurb, I think, for the back of Magic Fish, right? You're ready for the cannibalism, right? Let's talk a little bit about the art of Magic Fish, comics obviously being stories and pictures. You talked about, metaphorically about fairy tales, changing outfits, changing dress, but the costuming, the attention to detail of the dresses that are used, of the outfits. Can you talk a little bit about that process, how you did research? It clearly mattered to you, these dresses, right? They weren't just a rote dress where you're like, I think this is what a dress looks like. There's clearly a love of the research and the attention to detail. If you could talk about that a little bit. Yeah,
so I'm not someone who knows very much about fashion at all. I went to Catholic school, so that meant that I spent most of my life wearing a uniform, so I never thought about clothes. And so when I started making comics, and I started looking at fairy tales, and I started looking at illustrations, I realized that every detail contributes to the storytelling. And so I realized pretty early on in the process that the selection of clothes that show up on a page is really important to the storytelling. I sat in on a panel at one point when I went to a convention, I think it was Emerald City Comic Con, and there was an artist who was giving kind of general comics advice, and one of the pieces of advice that he gave was, if you make a comic book, you should draw everybody in t-shirts and jeans if you want it to be timeless, because then they can't position the story in time anywhere. And I thought that was really sad, actually, because it's really because the clothes that you select and the time in which your story takes place is really instructive to the reader. It helps situate readers where they need to be in the story. And so I leaned really hard in the opposite direction, and I was like, if I'm going to put characters in specific clothes, I'm going to be as specific as possible. I'm going to do a ton of research, and that kind of helped me learn more about the ways that we kind of imagine a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted in popular culture. So it was a fun experience of, looking through the archives and figuring out, why do dresses look this way, and why does this place have this kind of architecture? So all kinds of little nerdy details I got really wrapped up in very quickly.
It's absolutely beautiful. As we flip through, the thumbnails. Lost my train of thought. See, the art is very distracting. It's
good, I'm glad.
Those of you that, if I have one criticism of Magic Fish, it's that the pages are so beautiful that I often found myself stopping just to oogle over the artwork. So you should apologize to everyone for drawing so magnificently. But could you unpack some of the artistic influences? Because
sure.
I know there's obviously a certain amount of comic and manga influence floating through, but then from what I understand, there's a lot of illustration-based influences also.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't have a background in comics. Apparently, if you want to work in comics, you really just have to be very passionate and good at a couple of foundational things, but you can come from basically anywhere. And so I studied art history, and I focused in learning about children's book illustration in the early 1900s. And so that's kind of why my work looks kind of like this, is because that was my field of study when I was in college. And I did grow up reading a ton of manga, and so a lot of that works its way into my work as well. And the way that I work and the style that I work in is all kind of just a mishmash of all of these things. And so it's kind of a made-up style. I had no designs on working in, traditional your cape and tights kind of comics. I never thought that my style would be super appropriate for superhero comics, and so I never tried to do that, but I wound up doing some of that anyway because of this work. But for specifically for these dresses, they're kind of based off of real dresses kind of from the early 20th century. And I realized that a lot of the dresses that we think of as princess dresses are because of Disney, because in the 1950s, Disney produced Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. And the 1950s are a fun time for dresses in particular because they were after the World Wars. And during the World Wars, fabric was rationed. And so all of the clothes in the 1940s are very conservative. They use very little fabric, and they're all super practical. And then after the austerity measures were lifted, the dresses could become enormous again. So this is Audrey Hepburn in a Givenchy dress that Givenchy actually made. And this was for Sabrina. And that was in a reaction to a specific place in time in history, and because Disney referenced that has become an enduring part of our popular imagination, and we never think about that sort of stuff. And so it was the first time that I learned about that, and so I was really kind of blown away by the depth that that visual storytelling can give you in a comic book.
I just want to take a second. Janelle was floating around. Janelle is bringing around, I believe, Post-it notes if any of you guys have questions and want to write them down. I like your enthusiasm, sir. But we'll write them down, and then Janelle will get them to me via the magic of Bluetooth and the internet, and we'll go from there. So if any of you out there ever made a comic before, even a one-page comic? Some of you. There's a couple floating around, right? You know how much work is involved. Right, and Trung, you wrote this story, obviously drew it, and also colored it. From what I understand, coloring is not your favorite step. Can you talk about the compromise that was made there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, because I grew up reading a lot of manga, I read Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon and all of it. I was not picky, I read everything. I was used to reading stories in black and white, and so when I pitched the Magic Fish, all of the pages that were a part of the pitch document were black and white images. And my editors were like, this is really nice. This is very pretty. Also, we want to print this in full color, so you're going to have to come up with a way to color it. And I was like, okay. But one of the really nice things about working professionally is that as long as you're upfront about your limitations, if you're like, hey, I don't know how to do this very well, or I don't find this to be very exciting, people will work with you to kind of come up with a compromise. And so my editors and I came to a compromise, and we said that I could work in a limited palette. I could just use the same hue, but then I could change the values of it on every page to kind of give everything a little bit more depth, and that's what I wound up going with. And that became an important storytelling tool later.
Oh, it's really fantastic. I assume there seems to be a strong Art Nouveau influence as well. Okay, yeah. I know you talked about kind of children's authors and a lot of that illustration work. The hair, right, we can all agree is magnificent. It's really fantastic. So, a lot of times comics and art itself, but really I feel like in particular comics, are described as an iceberg where at the end the reader only sees, the story, but there's so much research, there's so much development, there's so many cut scenes and kind of stuff that is left behind. Were there any scenes in Magic Fish that you left out that were right on the bubble in terms of? Yeah,
there was actually a whole other fairy tale that I had planned to include in the Magic Fish that didn't make it into the final cut. There is a Japanese fairy tale called Urashima Taro and the Turtle Princess. And I realized actually while I was doing more research is that there are a ton of stories, there are a ton of fairy tales all over the world that are about time travel a little bit. Like we have Rip Van Winkle in the United States, there's that Japanese fairy tale that I just mentioned, and then there are the fairyland stories from kind of like Celtic myth. And they're all kind of like about, you go into the fairy realm and you spend a bunch of time there, and time moves differently between the fairy realm and the human realm. And so you step back out in the human realm and suddenly hundreds of years have passed, even though only a couple of years have passed in your recollection. And that's kind of the feeling that you get when you're, an immigrant and you leave a place for a while and then you come back and suddenly everything is different. And I thought that fairy tale would echo that sentiment a little bit. And so there was a little bit more of an arc in terms of the mother character kind of returning to Vietnam and discovering that things were entirely different. But because of time constraints, I could not include that. And I thought, 3 fairy tales is a nice number. so we cut that one out, and I can save that one for another project. Yeah,
no, that's excellent. So we're going to open it up to questions in just a minute. But one of my favorite, I don't know if we passed the slide. One of my favorite concise slides that you have in your presentation, Trung, is script writing is really hard. Can you talk about that balance? There he is.
Yeah.
The balance of writing and art for you, and how you approach that kind of dance.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a little weird in that I am usually hired to do both the writing and the drawing. Usually, comics are a team effort, and you have like a writer and then a penciler and an inker and a colorist and a letterer and a designer and an editor. And so there are a lot of different people working on oftentimes comic books that come out on a regular schedule. But because I work in graphic novels through traditional publishing, I get to be the sole author, which I think is really great, but it's a ton of work. And I think I started drawing things with an understanding that I'm a visually oriented person. Like I was one of those kids who drew tons of pictures in his notebooks and in classes, and would distract himself with images all the time. So I really thought that I was a visually oriented person, and it turns out that I was wrong. I'm not a visual thinker at all. I just like to draw pictures, and I need to have structure, and I need to have a sense of direction. And so I had to learn how to write before I could start to actually draw the story, because the story becomes much more permanent when those pictures are created, and it's harder to edit them. When you're writing a script, you can go back and delete and move things around, and it's very easy, but once you've drawn things and committed images to a page, it takes so much labor to fix those. And so I needed to have the script completely done before I did any of the drawing. And so that was really hard. And because I The Magic Fish is the very first work of fiction I've ever read or written. So I've never like written fan fiction. Like I've never like written any fiction before at all. So I leaned on the only writing skills that I had at the time, and that was essay writing. The last thing I ever wrote was an essay for college. And so The Magic Fish is actually, if you pay attention very closely, structured exactly like an essay. It starts with a thesis statement, and then there are 3 supporting arguments, and then you reiterate the thesis again at the end with a twist.
It's the most beautiful essay I believe that's ever been committed to paper. So that's actually a great bridge into some of the questions. We're going to start opening it up to both in-person questions, and then we have some questions from online. A question from the audience, Trung, says, and I believe you answered this, were you a visual artist first? And so when would you say was the moment they said, how old were you when you became a writer too? Did you consider yourself a writer?
Yeah, I wasn't a writer until I was like 28 years old when I started writing The Magic Fish. I never considered myself a writer. I consider myself to be a competent copywriter. So if I can write, I can edit, I know how to do things very formally, but as someone who is a fiction writer who knows the craft of it, that's something I'm still learning and I'm very new at. And it's not something, like I'm not someone who's kind of a perfectionist about that sort of thing. I like messing up and I like making work that's really ugly because I think that's where growth happens, and I want people to make more ugly, embarrassing stuff so that they can build on that. It helps you grow. Yeah. So I am still very new at writing. I've only been writing for, I think, a couple of years now, so I'm still working my way through it. The visual art is where I'm much more confident.
Another question from the audience is, are the friends in the book real? If so, what happened to them?
So the friends in the book are kind of based on friends that I'd had growing up. So they're fictional characters. I imagine that they all remain friends because they all seem to be very supportive of one another. And the people that they are kind of based on are still people in my life. And until something catastrophic happens, I imagine that they will still be there. So, I think they're all still friends.
Another question is, how are LGBTQIA issues viewed different in Vietnamese culture?
Well, I think that's a very broad question, too, because, Vietnamese culture is like there are a lot of Vietnamese people and a lot of them will feel differently. So I think depending on who you ask and depending on what generation they are, so just like any group of people, like they'll feel a little bit differently. I think my parents are actually kind of surprising in that they were very cool with it from the very beginning, even though they didn't know how to talk about it. And I think that's actually kind of unusual. I think I've heard from a lot of other queer Vietnamese American families that, their coming out was actually quite difficult. And so I had like a uniquely positive experience. So I don't know enough to talk about it super broadly, like as a whole community. I think it's just like everywhere else where things are sort of trending in a positive direction. But I can't say for certain that everybody feels positively about it.
Speaking of your parents, I went to the presentation you did last night. Can you talk about your fake strict Asian parents?
Oh my gosh.
I found this amazing.
Yeah, my parents are, so they're a little bit on the younger side. My mom had me when she was like 20, and so we're like buddies now. So when they came here, they'd been through a lot of, they'd seen some really terrible things kind of growing up in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, and they were Vietnamese boat people. And so they had a very harrowing immigrant refugee experience. And so when they came here, their philosophy was largely like, we had a really difficult life, and if you don't have a really good time, it will all have been for nothing, so you need to go and have a really nice time. And so they were very supportive of everything that I wanted to do, and they remain so. And they, they didn't know how to articulate it very well, but, they wanted me to find my own way and find my own passions. And for some reason in my head, I was like, I got it in my head that I needed to please my parents and make sure that they were proud of me. They gave me no kind of pressure, but I was like, I need to not let them down. And so I imagined that my parents were way stricter than they were, and that kept me very motivated. And I got really good grades, and I think I made them really proud, but my parents were very much like, you can do what you want. I don't know why you're so stressed about all of this.
That's amazing. So I'm going to break this question into two. Do you have, Trung, a favorite fairy tale? Is there one that stands above the others for you?
Yeah, I think my favorite fairy tale is East of the Sun and West of the Moon. That one is really similar to Beauty and the Beast. It has a lot of the same roots as Beauty and the Beast in that I think it's based off of Cupid and Psyche, which is a really small story that shows up as a part of, I think, the Odyssey. East of the Sun and West of the Moon is my favorite fairy tale.
And a second part of that, do you have a favorite superhero or superhero story?
Ooh, okay. This is difficult because I have a lot of trouble choosing. I really like all of the space alien superheroes. So I love like the Martian Manhunter and Starfire and Superman. Like all of those have like very, like resonant immigrant origin stories. Like they come from another place and they're learning the culture and they're trying to do their best. Like that is just a kind of superhero that's really resonant with me in particular. On the Marvel side of things, for some reason, I really latched onto the Scarlet Witch because when I was little, there was this terrible cartoon on like Fox Kids, and she shows up as this superhero. She has this horrible accent, and for some reason, I really liked her character design and her arc and her powers. And so she'd always been like my favorite. And so it's been very exciting for me to be an adult fan and to suddenly have her show up in the movies and have her own show.
That's fantastic. A question from the audience. What are some tips for drawing and writing?
Ooh, okay. So the advice that I usually give to people is go out and buy cheap materials that you don't feel like is super important, because that helps you make a lot of stuff and you grow a lot more if you just like make tons and tons of stuff without feeling precious about it. I realized like when I was a college student and I didn't have any money at all, and I, would go out and I would buy myself fancier art materials, I would get so scared because it felt like suddenly there was a ton of pressure to make something beautiful and impressive. But when I went to like Office Max and got a bunch of office paper and a bunch of pens there, I could just make lots of things that I didn't feel like I didn't feel any pressure to be perfect. And so I made a ton of stuff, and some of it surprised me. Some of it was really ugly, and some of it was very embarrassing. But I grew from those because out of some of that stuff, like there's still techniques that I gleaned from that experience that I still use to this day. So even if the work wasn't very satisfying, even if it's messy, that's the stuff that helps you grow the most. And so my best advice is to do stuff that you wouldn't show to other people and let go of the need to be perfect. Just be messy. It's going to be good for you.
That freedom to fail, right?
Yes, freedom to fail.
Yeah. How do you think you made it this far? Did you believe in yourself?
I made it this far by accident. I think I made it this far literally just because I had considered that making comics was a form of personal expression for me. I didn't think that I was going to be doing it professionally. And so I still got to keep and maintain a really positive relationship with form because it was never driven into me that, I have to do it exactly this way and that I have to navigate the professional environment this way. I kind of got to make my way through it at my own speed. Mm-hmm. And so I still love making comics and love doing it. And because I approached it as a fan, there's this sense of humility that you talk to everybody with. And so everything is exciting. And I think coming at comics with that sense of enthusiasm and without the cynicism that comes from working in it as an industry for a very long time kind of helped me, make work that I feel really good about.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We have a question from YouTube. Ben Jenkins on YouTube wants to know, was there a reason why you chose red, purple, and yellow for the different storylines? And along those lines, why did you integrate the orange and the peaches into some of the purple fairy tale panels?
Ooh, those are great questions. Okay, so we settled on the different fairy tale stories and the different kind of story universes in the book are colored differently. And so the yellow indicates that the story is taking place in the past. The kind of reds and pinks indicate that the story is taking taking place in the present, and the purples and blues are fairy tales. And I had originally decided that it was just going to be pink and yellow because I was like, the story either takes place in the present or the past. And then I had to come up with another one for the fairy tale one. So the past color was the one that I came up with first. It was sepia toned a little bit because people conflate that with the past. Like, you look at an old picture, it looks kind of yellowish. And so I was like, if I colored it in this yellow color, people will understand that this is an older moment in the book. And then after that, the pinks and the reds were very present oriented. I wanted it to be a color that reminded people of like their heartbeat or their blood or viscera a little bit, which is kind of gross, but like I wanted it to be a present minded color. And so I came up with that sort of red color. And the blues were kind of this sort of like magical, kind of that purple became something that I wanted to conflate with fairy tales. And then I realized that I had essentially organized them into different parts of the day. Like the past takes place in the morning, the present takes place in the middle of the day, so those like intense reds. And then the fairy tales take place kind of like in the evening with like the sort of bedtime story color. And so that kind of became the ongoing conceit of the colors. The peaches were kind of a part of the narrative, like they were a stronger part of the narrative at first, but I mostly kind of used them to help contrast the different colors and kind of give it a pop of contrast. But they are also kind of the center of some of my favorite snacks, and so I was like, oh, you know what? I want to include my favorite desserts in this book.
Which desserts are these strung?
You know what? Those peach tarts are something that are real and that I've enjoyed before. And I also, so weirdly enough, those peaches are like a much bigger portion of the Vietnamese Cinderella story, because in the version that I was told, she actually gets murdered 3 times and then she comes back and then she gets reincarnated and is born again in a peach tree. And so her husband plucks a peach, and then he cracks it open, and then she emerges from it, is a part of that. And I couldn't include that actually in the book because I just didn't have enough time to have her die 3 times. so I was like, you know what, I'm going to put that iconography everywhere else in the book as well. So yeah, so there are a bunch of different reasons, ranging from I like this dessert to this was an integral part of this story, and this is deep lore.
Every creative out there, I think, is channeling this particular question. Do you get stressed when you write or draw?
I get stressed when I do both because they're both a lot of work. Yeah, so I get stressed about them for different reasons, because when I'm writing, the stress comes from this is something that I'm learning how to do. And so I have to break myself of that habit of, like I want to get it right. So I'm learning on the job while I'm writing. And then the drawing I get stressed about because it's the most physically taxing part of the job. So I have to make sure that I take breaks and that I stretch and that I am spending time, looking at other people's work as well, so that I can maintain a positive working relationship with the medium.
Yeah. And the first half, generally, of the book is done traditionally, and the second half is done digitally. What was that shift like for you? Obviously, you've spoken, you did it to kind of speed up the timeline of things. Were there any other benefits or drawbacks to switching to digital?
Yeah, so switching to digital was really hard for me because I love working traditionally. So most of the Magic Fish was done in pen and ink, and so my process was that I would take a piece of office paper, and then I would draw the page in pencil, and then I would ink over it. I would wait for the ink to dry, and then after the ink was dry, I would erase all of the pencil and clean it up, and then I would scan it, and then I would format it in Photoshop, and then I would send it to my editor. And that's a lot of different steps, and after a couple hundred pages, those steps really add up. And so I needed to learn how to draw in a way where I could just draw the page and then be done with it and send it right away to my editor without all of those different steps in between. So it was so that I could accommodate my deadlines to be a professional working artist and make sure that my editors were not super stressed because I like them. They're great people and I would like for them to want to work with me again. And I hated the feeling of drawing on glass. Like I had a Cintiq and I got, everything that I could to help it feel a little bit more like paper. So it was something that I actually had to learn how to do. I'm much better at it now. It feels much more natural to me, but I still like working traditionally better.
And I know a lot of students and young artists out there will have this question. What program do you generally use digitally? And do you have specific brushes or tools that you use?
Yeah, I started out using Photoshop, which I hated. And then I switched to Clip Studio Paint, which I loved so much better. And a part of it was because I'd gotten the experience of working in Photoshop, so it felt more natural to draw on the page in CSP. And I use an iPad now, so it's a little bit closer to paper with the right, screen cover. And I use Clip Studio Paint. I make my own brushes, and so I'll take a brush that is preset, and then I'll change some of the settings so that it articulates in a way that I like, that the pressure sensitivity is right and the tilt sensitivity is right. This is all very technical stuff. But I like making my own brushes. Occasionally an artist will make custom brushes, and I'll buy them to support them, and then I'll find out that I really like the texture in some of them, or I like the way that it looks, in contrast to another thing. And so, artists will put out their tools, and you can actually continue to customize them after you've already purchased them. So I love making my own custom brushes, and I like looking for other new brushes to use too.
A question from the audience: which of the 3 dresses was your favorite?
I think my favorite has to be, I think it might actually be the Starlight dress. Yeah, the last one was my favorite. The other 2 were my favorite when I designed them, but I designed them all in order, so I just liked each of them more. And I think that's appropriate to the fairy tale too, because one after the other is supposed to be slightly more impressive. And so I wound up really liking the Starlight dress at the end, so that's this one.
And so for those of the students out there planning their first graphic novel, how long did Magic Fish take you from start to finish?
Yeah, so it took me a little over 2 years. And so it took me 2 years to actually make the whole thing, about 6 months to write it, the whole script, and then the rest of the time to just draw it. And then I spent a couple of months working on the pitch beforehand too, so the whole process took slightly more than 2 years for me. And it's different for every person depending on where their skills are. Some comic authors are able to bang out a script in a couple of weeks and then just spend the rest of the time drawing it, and my balance is a little different, but that's about how long it took for me.
We have a question from the audience. Was the priest based on a real interaction or a general religious sentiment?
The priest was a conversation that was based on a real interaction that I had when I was actually a teenager, and so I was a little older than the main character when that conversation happened with me. And it actually happened with the president of my high school at the time, where he kind of took me aside and was like, hey, these are what Catholics feel like this is what the dogma of the Vatican is around homosexuality, was the verbiage at the time. And so, that was a conversation that I had as a teenager. I think I was 16 years old, and an adult man was like, hey, if you come out to your parents, they're going to feel like you're dead, so you probably shouldn't do this. Wow. Which was not something, in hindsight as an adult now, I'm actually very angry about that interaction, because I did not think that was an appropriate thing for him to say to a teenager.
Yeah. What is the biggest issue you face when you write or draw? We talked about the stress, right? Of working.
Okay. The biggest issue, I wonder if they mean formally as I'm working, or if they're meaning a little bit more broadly as in terms of the themes that I'm working with. So I guess I'll answer both. So the biggest issue that I'm working with when I'm just kind of trying to do the work is that I get really into the thing that I'm working on, and then I forget to stop and take breaks and stretch. And then I'll start feeling my arm clamp up a little bit. I'm like, oh shoot, I need to make sure that I take care of myself physically, because I don't want to develop carpal tunnel and have a lot of trouble drawing later on in my life. So that's kind of the biggest issue that I'm having while I'm actually working. And then thematically, industry-wide, I think some of the bigger issues that I encounter today are actually book bans, which is so strange and interesting to me. It wasn't something that I'd ever considered that I would run into, but the Magic Fish ends up in a lot of kind of suggested book challenge lists in a lot of different states. And so librarians and teachers have been doing a really great job advocating for it, but that seems to be something that I am encountering more and more.
Wow. Yeah, your teachers and your librarians out in the community do a great job of defending books from book bans and challenges. Can Can I ask what are some of the challenges that have been brought?
Yeah,
Magic
they
Fish?
have all been around the LGBTQ content, which I think is really interesting because The Magic Fish is it's technically a young adult graphic novel, but I wrote it in a way that would make it very accessible to a very broad age range. So there's no swearing in it, there's no sex, like there's none of the stuff that would make a parent really bristle. And so if someone wants to ban my book, they have to admit that they don't like queer people, was kind of the strategy behind that. And so every time it shows up, like nobody ever mentions the cannibalism, but everybody has a problem with the mother loving her son even though he's gay. It's very strange.
Sadly, I thought that's what it might be, but I was hoping it was going to be the cannibalistic fish.
Ban my book for something cool.
I know, right? They have to develop a whole new category, right? Flesh-eating animals, fish, right? This is this was your first graphic novel. Obviously, you had drawn before this online. You had done short stories. What gave you the confidence to jump into a full-length graphic novel?
I think I just felt like it. I think, I had gotten to a point in my, creative development where I felt like I was ready. Like I have a long story to tell. I would like to work in a longer format and see how that sits with me. And I think honestly, leading up to that, I had done a lot of smaller projects and I'd worked with other writers and other creatives that I really admired. So I worked with Alex DeCampi and Marguerite Bennett are two of the writers that I tended to like to work with the most. And they're incredible to work with, and they were really wonderful advocates for all of their colleagues and their creative collaborators. And I think having people like that who are really passionate about their work and are really great to work with in general and who value your work, like that really helped me become more confident in my skills, and that helps me feel like I was ready.
And one question that I feel like has been kind of answered, but I want to unpack it a little bit. The question is, are you the boy in the book?
Am I?
How much do you think of it as you? How much is it a kind of way of unpacking or kind of working through your childhood?
Sure.
How do you relate to the character?
Okay, so in general, I'll say that the boy is separate from me. But there are definitely parts of him that were inspired by things in my life. And I think at the very beginning, I was very sure that I didn't want to write something autobiographical. And then I realized that every time I'd read somebody's first novel, it was always a little bit confessional. And so I was like, oh, this is something that everybody does. Like your very first project is going to be a little bit personal. It's going to be a little bit confessional. And so the parts of him that feel very close to me are there because they do exist in my life. And so I think the simplest way I can imagine that is that he's like a little part of me and he's an imagined part of me, but I think we do have a very strong relationship, even though he's his own character.
Was there, as you developed the style from the book, there's a question from the audience, did you find that the way you drew shifted to fight this much more long form type of story?
Yeah. When you work on a really long project, the way that you work on it will change a lot. Especially, and it wasn't something that I was very, I didn't have any feelings about it. One of my favorite series is Oh My Goddess by Kosuke Fujishima. And he'd been drawing that from the 80s all the way up until the 2010s. And it finally stopped at 59 issues or something like that. Really thick issues. And so, and you can see the art style change over time. And so I was really comfortable kind of letting the art style shift, especially since I was shifting from traditional to digital. I knew things were going to change a little.
Did you ever go back and readjust some of the earlier artwork for continuity?
No, if I drew something traditionally, that was what I was committing to. So everything that I drew after that had to follow that. So I would adjust the digital stuff. I wouldn't touch any of the traditional stuff.
Excellent. So what is next on your plate, Trung?
I have another graphic novel that I'm working on through Random House Graphic called Angelica and the Bear Prince that I'm very excited about. I have a small Marvel project that I'm working on in a digital format that I can't talk about yet, but that'll be fun. It's with a character that I feel like is really underappreciated, and I get to give her a slightly new lease on life, so I'm really excited about that one too.
Excellent. And we'll end with this question from me, because that's the moderator's prerogative.
Okay.
Right. This graphic novel obviously is all you except for the lettering. The lettering is beautiful. That is the one element that is not you, and I assume you did not print the book yourself
Right.
in a print studio. As a writer, who is an artist that would be a kind of dream collaborator? And as a artist, who would be a writer that would be a dream collaborator?
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I've never had like pipe dreams about collaboration. I'm a little bit of a control freak, so I like to do everything myself. But one of my favorite comic book artists at the moment is an Italian fellow by the name of Gigi Cavanago. He does a lot of work that we've probably never read here in the States, but I think like Dylan Dog is like this pulpy, like Constantine-esque comic that he has drawn on before, and his pages are so gorgeous, it's unbelievable. So he's currently my favorite. As far as writers go, I think, man, Terry Pratchett has died, so I'm really sad that I will never be able to collaborate with him, because I love his writing style quite a lot. But I think like as far as writers go, I'd love to work with Marguerite Bennett again. I love the way that she crafts like lyrical work on top of like really gritty stuff, like at the same time. She can do everything. So I'm just So if Marguerite wants to work with me again, she needs to
Marguerite,
reach out.
hopefully she's watching the virtual thing as we speak.
Right.
All right, so can we all thank Trung Le Nguyen for being here today? Thank you, guys.
Yes.
And I'm gonna pass the metaphorical mic back over to Janelle for some final words.
Thanks, Alonzo. Can we hear it one more time for author Trung Le Nguyen? Trung, we're so appreciative to have you here in San Diego, and to have you share all of the magic behind the magic fish, no pun intended there. It's a beautiful book, and a One Book, One San Diego favorite. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
And thank you, Alonzo, for moderating the talk today. We're so appreciative. And everyone, check out Little Fish Comic Book Studio here in San Diego. They're one of our One Book, One San Diego partners, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much, Alonzo.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience here at the Comic-Con Museum. Thank you to all of you online for tuning in today. We have a very special thank you to all of the educators and schools and students participating today. Just a few are up here on the screen. So thank you so much for making this possible. We're so appreciative of all of your support. And we hope you enjoyed the event today. And that wraps our program. So make sure you stay tuned with what's next for One Book. And thank you all so much. All right. So.